Hi, this is Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's April 24th, Thursday, and there's several things that I want to talk about, which some people have been discussing them, but I want to talk about them from maybe a little bit different angle. So I'm going to talk about four things. One is the situation with the State Department. The second is I got a very interesting email from a very cool commentator named Don Hank, and he seems to be a devout Christian, and he has been complaining vociferously about the nature of the Christian right in the United States. I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about the role of the U.S. as I call it the mediator as perpetrator, or you could say the perpetrator as the mediator. And finally, Jimmy Carter's thoughts on China versus the United States. So first of all, let's talk about the State Department. There's been a number of reports where Trump has said that he wants to cut the State Department by something like close to 50%. And this sounds like it would be pretty catastrophic. I mean, he's talking about um, taking a number of embassies out of the African continent, and also reducing the number of employees. There's like 80,000 State Department employees. He wants to cut that number, drastically, maybe by half. And what implications does this have for U.S. diplomacy? Well, let's take a look at what is the track that diplomacy is on right now in terms of the war in Ukraine. You've got negotiations where Trump basically says that Ukraine is recalcitrant. They just won't compromise on anything, and so it's time for the United States to cut bait. Well, it's not really quite like that because it was, after all, he says it's not my war. Okay, so let's get a few things straight here. This war in Ukraine has been going on since 1945. That's right, 1945, because during the Second World War, there was this a faction within the society within Ukraine, the broader area of what used to be part of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, was quite extremely hostile to Russia. Not all, most Ukrainians were not that way, actually. And during the time of the Soviet Union, when the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was part of the Soviet Union, it was one of the most advanced and prosperous areas in the Soviet Union. I have a personal friend, actually, who lives in one of the major cities of Ukraine, and she told me that her city is it was a beautiful Soviet city, and she liked the Soviet Union. This is not what you hear from people. Many of these Ukrainians that say, "Oh, those Russians or those Soviets were so bad to us." Well, where did your electricity come from? Where did your house? This woman is living in a house that was built by Khrushchev. They produced. They knew that they had a housing shortage, so they decided, okay, we're going to build a million houses so that people have a place to live. Heaven forbid the United States, which has 500,000 homeless people, and they don't know how to solve that problem. Soviet Union, they said, we have a problem. They didn't have people homeless. They just had people crowded into small apartments together. It was not so great. So they built a number of, I think there were at least two waves of apartment buildings that were built, I think, during Stalin's time and also during Khrushchev's time. So when you have these Ukrainian nationals say, "What did the Soviets ever do for us?" They're ingrates. They don't understand. And besides, the aerospace industry was very prominent in Ukraine. As I say, the electrical infrastructure, massive hydroelectric dams, the biggest nuclear power plants. which are still operating and still, providing energy to Ukraine. Those were all built by the Soviet Union. So, but these basically these far right factions of Ukrainian society just have this rabid hatred for anything Russian, even though Russian and Ukrainian are we say brotherly people. They're far closer to each other in terms of their ethnicity than say the English and the Spanish, something like that. But in any case, the Soviet Union did a lot for Ukraine, but what happened was, because of the United States' visceral hatred for the Soviet Union and then for Russia itself, it backed these Ukrainian these were Nazis. They have swastikas. They have tattoos of Adolf Hitler, and they glorify the whole Nazi ideology. And they're also as brutal as Nazis were. And so this was going on, during World War II. They were massacring people, and after World War II, there was these factions. Many of them escaped to Canada or to the United States, Argentina, other countries like that. But also basically what happened was the precursor to the CIA, and then the CIA itself said, these people, we know they're terrorists. Their internal documents actually say, we know that this guy Stefan Bandera is a terrorist, but he's undermining the Soviet Union, and so we need to back him. That was going on post-World War II and into the 1950s. So finally the Soviet Union did root these people out and put them either into jail, killed them, put them into jail, or they left, they escaped. In the case of Stefan Bandera, he escaped to Germany, but he was hunted down by a KGB agent and assassinated. The guy's a war criminal, so that's too bad for Stefan Bandera. He chose the wrong side. But in any case, during that whole period of when this post World War II, you had that faction basically go underground. But when the Soviet Union ended, and it was basically it was voluntary. What happened was not necessarily legally voluntary, but there were certain factions within the Soviet Union, and particularly within certain Soviet republics, that wanted to break up the Soviet Union, and the reason for that was because they wanted to get control of those countries for themselves. It was a very opportunistic situation. So and of course the United States, and England with their, they live and die by divide and conquer. They latched onto these people and financed them and nurtured them. And in 1991, it was kind of like field day for the West to come in, and by 2004 there was essentially a coup against the democratically elected government. But then in the following election, he was a culturally Russian person named Yanukovych, and he was given a mandate to run the country, mainly because the vote of the eastern part of Ukraine was so overwhelming in his favor that that's how he got to be president. And but the United States and Europe, cooked up this plan to get rid of him, because the plan has always been to turn Ukraine against Russia. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book The Grand Chessboard, openly talked about that. So here we are in 2014, and Victoria Nuland gives a talk in front of an audience and says that they've spent $5 billion nurturing Ukrainian democracy, which translates into we've been meddling in Ukraine, for many, many years to undermine sympathy for Russia within Ukraine, with black propaganda, forgetting all the things that the Soviet Union did for Ukraine. forgetting the fact that most of the Ukrainians were on the side of the Soviet Union. One of the most important armies within the Soviet army that defeated the Nazis was the First Ukrainian Front. So the Ukrainians, there were millions of Ukrainians fought on the side of the Soviet Union. But you have that faction that basically got control of the government with the help of the United States and with Great Britain. Great Britain sounds kind of what's so great about this country? That's a whole other topic. You can ask an Indian or a Chinese what they think of all the great things that Britain did for them. But in any case, so the United States foments this war against Russia using these Ukrainian Nazis. And they thought that they could bleed Russia to death, and through sanctions and through the building up of the Ukrainian military to NATO standards. But it didn't work out. So that brings the State Department to fore in terms of how the United States is thinking, how are we going to get out of this mess that we actually created? And we won't even admit that we created it. We're going to act as the mediator in this conflict, even though we're the perpetrator of this conflict. So who are the three main people that we hear talking about this, talking about negotiations? You have Marco Rubio, who is an admitted neocon, former senator, elevated to be the Secretary of State. You have a guy named, I think his name is Keith Kellogg. He was a former general, and he creates a plan which is it's basically saying to Russia, since you've lost, we'll be nice to you. The only problem being is that the Ukrainian military has been it's well on the way to being completely wiped out, and Kellogg is living in a dreamland. It is simply not. He's living in a world that doesn't exist, and yet he's going to try and foist this plan onto Russia. And there's an argument to be made that he may have, this whole plan may have been cooked up to be so ridiculous that it's like we're going to present. We know we're losing, okay, but we have to figure out a way to get out of this situation without you're sending nuclear missiles to Washington, something like that. So we have to extricate ourselves out of this mess that we've created. It's like in Afghanistan, we created that problem, and then we had to get out of it, and it really didn't. It was very messy. And Vietnam, it was, we created that problem. It was very messy. And here we are in Ukraine, and it's a big mess. But we don't want to just get our asses kicked out of Ukraine. We don't want. We're pretending that we have no presence in Ukraine, which is ridiculous because U.S. weapons are being fired into Russia, and they're being manned by U.S. personnel. So this is a war of the United States against Russia. It always has been, and but the U.S. they're such cowards that they won't even admit it. So here we are in this negotiation phase of how the hell are we going to get out of this mess. And you've got, as I say, you've got a former senator, you've got a former general, and you've got a real estate developer. Now, let's compare that negotiating team with the Russian Federation. You have Sergei Lavrov, who has been the Secretary of State and the head of the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation for 20 years. And before he was the foreign minister, he's like the number one person in the foreign ministry of the Russian Federation. He was the UN ambassador. So he lived in New York for several years, speaks fluent English, and he's just an authority, you know. He's got a second person in the named Sergei Ryabkov, who's also a career diplomat in the in the Russian Federation Foreign Ministry. You have the spokesperson for the foreign ministry named Maria Zakharova, and her parents were diplomats in China, and she's the spokesperson. She's the spokesperson for the Russian Federation Foreign Ministry. And the point that I'm making here is that the Russian Foreign Ministry is made up of real bona fide professionals, whereas the people who are running foreign policy for the United States are like second stringer amateurs. You know, what diplomatic expertise does Kellogg have, or Rubio? He's a politician, you know, and Witkoff, he's a real estate developer. What are these people doing conducting foreign policy? So the whole thing is just it's got to be a fiasco because they just the Americans are completely outclassed, and not only are they outclassed in terms of the people that they send to negotiate, but now Trump is talking about not professionalizing the State Department by maintaining levels and increasing education for people to really become real diplomats, where they go deep into the history of what is what is our relationship with these countries. They don't do that. Ray McGovern is one of the great commentators nowadays. He's in his mid-80s and he's still very lucid, very intelligent, and he gives great historical background to the explanation of current events. And no, he worked on the information side of the CIA, which means that he was not involved in dirty tricks. He was involved in just finding out what he was the head of the Russian and the Soviet part of the CIA information branch, and he speaks fluent Russian. He studied Russian history. He can recite Russian poetry. The guy is a real professional. He was deeply involved in negotiating the very first arms control treaty in 1972, I think it was, and he went to Moscow for the signing of that treaty. He is the kind of professional that it would make sense for the United States to have running its foreign policy. But does he get a call from Trump? No. So this is the state of U.S. diplomacy is deplorable. But the worst part of it is that as the State Department is getting cut from its already, what can I say, anemic state, cadaverous state, the military budget is being increased. So it's like, Teddy Roosevelt, who I think Donald Trump is a great fan of, said, talk softly and carry a big stick. This was gunboat diplomacy, where you don't have to negotiate with people, you threaten them. And if they don't stand up to your threat, or if they stand up to your threats, then you bomb them, or you stage a coup against the country, or you assassinate the leader. This is what U.S. foreign policy is all about. William Blum wrote a book called Killing Hope, where he talked about 60-plus interventions, illegal interventions of the United States and other countries' affairs. This is not diplomacy, and so this is just a really this is not a winning recipe for our country to be a responsible citizen of the world and to be accepted. Basically the U.S. is isolating itself by being so obnoxious. So that's what I want to talk about with the State Department, and also it ties in with the fact that, as I was mentioning earlier, The United States was the complete perpetrator of this war in Ukraine. And it's a very sad commentary on the state of political consciousness within people in the United States, that even well-educated people simply have no concept of what is going on with their country. They really do not understand how things are run. They've got some people, they have a vague idea that things aren't great and the U.S. is imperialistic. But if you get into the weeds and you look on a case-by-case basis, how did things happen? You have people who they don't understand how the war in Ukraine really developed. As I just explained in my discussion here, this war did not start in 2022. It didn't start even in 2014. It didn't even start in 2004 or even in 1991. It goes all the way back to U.S. policy, which has been hostile to the Soviet Union and to Russia for literally decades. That is the reality. And because the U.S. Ruling class is so self-centered and so arrogant and in denial about taking any responsibility for its actions, they have the audacity to say, for Rubio to say, we've made every effort to negotiate with Russia between Ukraine and Russia, but Ukraine just doesn't, they're just not cooperating. Well, I'm sorry, Mark Rubio, you guys started this war. The reason why Russia's talking with you and not talking with Ukraine is because you are the opponent. You're the adversary. You want to destroy the country. And the reason why you want to destroy it is because you want to get Russia's resources. That's the story. Okay, now the other issue that I want to talk about is I got an email from a guy who is on Substack, and Substack is an amazing venue because it gives a voice to lots of independent writers and thinkers, and some of the people that I consider to be really authoritative. People like John Mearsheimer or Alistair Crook, or I think Scott Ritter's on Substack. I'm on Substack. You're watching this on Substack. So this is a really great venue. And the reason why I bring it up is because this guy, Don Hank, recently posted an article where he was talking about the Christian Zionists and how they're the opposite of what Jesus taught. The man is obviously a very ethical, very good person, and he has a very acute understanding of how the world works. I get his emails, and he pulls together a lot of information. Much of it is from Russian sources. So if you want to know what's going on from a Russian point of view, you can find out a lot of it from Don Hank, as well as other commentators. So he's talking about the Christian Zionists, and he says Christian Zionism is a form of temporary insanity, but it can be reversed. And so I just want to say, with all due respect to Don Hank, that the problem of this is the Christian Zionist worldview is it's a manifestation of a far deeper problem within the U.S. body politic and political consciousness. It is a virulently pro-Zionist narrative which basically justifies the genocide of what's going on in Palestine by the Zionists. But they're not the only rabidly pro-Zionist people. I mean, Joe Biden, as the president said, he's a Zionist. And he said if we didn't have Israel, we didn't have Israel as a floating aircraft carrier, we'd have to create it. But you have the Jewish lobby, which is It's more accurate to say the Zionist lobby because there are, significant voices within the broader Jewish community, like Jeffrey Sachs or Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, Norman Finkelstein, Gabor Mate. These are all Jewish voices who are saying, what Israel is doing is unconscionable. And I just saw there was a video discussion between Miko Peled, who was the son of an Israeli general, and Mika's position is that Israel needs it was a historical mistake to even do it in the first place. And he had on a guy who's a very, very Orthodox Jewish person from a sect called Natre Karta. And their position is that the whole idea of the state of Israel is from a theological point of view, it's unacceptable. So, so these voices are out there, but most of them are suppressed. But the problem with that I see with Don's argument here is that there are the nature of U.S. imperialism has manifested in many different ways for a long, long time. And we have to go back all the way to the founding of the country. So when the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, what became Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, they were on the verge of starvation, and the Indian tribes, the native people who lived in the area, took pity on them and basically saved. I think they lost, maybe half of the population that landed, that came over on the Mayflower. They lost half of the people to disease and cold and so on. You're talking about taking people from a quote-unquote civilization and dropping them in the middle of wilderness, and they're supposed to figure out how to live. It's like, what chance do they have of that? So the Native Americans basically helped them to figure out what to do. And their reward for that was that they got killed. So and the whole history of the U.S. has been Europeans have been coming over and killing Indians, since 1620. So you had that whole period during the 1600s. Then during the 1700s, you had the French and Indian Wars, and it got really serious in the 1800s with the Indian Wars, when the United States really became a country. The Constitution itself talked about merciless redskin savages. These merciless redskin savages kind of felt like you guys coming in from Europe here and stealing our land and doing all kinds of terrible things to us. We don't feel so good about that. We'd like to, we're going to fight. And yet, so this is a perfect example of Western civilization encroaching on another people, victimizing them, and when the people rise up, they call them the terrorists. It's like psychological projection. So that's just another example of it. The whole during the Indian Wars, this is, it was like mass expulsion and genocide. This was before Christian Zionism. Then, towards the end of the 19th century, the United States has now conquered all of North America, the lower 48, North America, and they're thinking, okay, well, let's see what's next on the menu. And you had a guy named William Randolph Hearst, who was eyeing the Spanish Empire. He thought they'd be good to get some resources from. So there was in Cuba. There was a rebellion of the people living in Cuba against the Spanish colonialists, and things were apparently fairly quiet there, relatively speaking. And a reporter sent back a message to William Randolph Hearst. I don't see anything much going on here. And William Randolph Hearst responded, "You send the photographs, I'll supply the war." And shortly after that, a U.S. ship blows up Years later, it turns out that there was a fire hazard, and it was not caused by any kind of sabotage or anything. It was an accident. But William Randolph Hearst says, "Oh, the Spanish sank our ship, so we got to go to war." And he called "Remember the Maine." So I always, when people talk about provocations for war and demonizing another country, I always say, remember the Maine. So whenever some country is being demonized by the United States, remember the Maine, because they're probably lying through their teeth, just like they lied through their teeth with Ukraine, where they're saying, poor little innocent Ukraine. No, it's not like that. We financed the worst elements of Ukrainian society to take over the government, to start a war against Russian ethnic-speaking people in Ukraine. We financed them, we equipped them, we trained them, but it's all Russia's fault. See, this is how it works. But this is part. What I'm saying here is that this is a part of an ongoing phenomenon that happens, and Don Hank talks about the Christian right, but on the other hand, you have the quote unquote woke left. Now, historically, the socialist movement has been anti-war, but unfortunately, it's been, in many cases, it's been co-opted. So in the First World War, there was tremendous opposition to the United States entering the First World War. The government, Edward Bernays, the chief propagandist, had to whip up the population to fight the nasty German Huns, when in fact it was really a war of England trying to suppress Germany, because England was the dominant power, and it didn't want Germany to challenge it. So that was what World War I was all about. But England, oh, those Germans, they're terrible, and they make up these stories, and they say, oh, America, please help us, against these nasty Germans, So this is all part of the same psychopathy of Western civilization. It's not just the Christian Zionists. So then you have, and of course, they whip the people up into this frenzy, but to the extent that the socialists, who have generally been on the side of the working class, and they say, we're the poor people, the rich people start the war, and then they draft us to go fight and die and bleed for it, and meanwhile they make all the profits. So again, this struggle has been going on for a long time before the Christian Zionists, and the same thing happened with Vietnam. Where we called the Vietnamese gooks and slopes and give them various racist epithets, and it's all designed to make the people go crazy. What is it, to increase their bloodlust, to get them to go and fight these terrible wars. So the U.S. has been involved in wars for like 90% of its history. This is extremely, from a psychological point of view, what kind of a statement does this make about the psychological state of the people in the United States if they continue after 200 years since 1776, putting up with this stuff? Yeah, the American Revolution made sense because the British were exploiting people, and so we had to get rid of them. And who wants a king anyway? But of course, the problem was with that was that the oligarchs in the United States basically co-opted the American Revolution, and they wrote the Constitution to favor themselves, which is another form of psychological aberration. So, and and it's all comes down to, the current time where in order to divide the working class, divide the people, they come up with this whole gender ideology, which is, it's absurd on its face, But forgive me, if I'm offending anybody here. But there's two kinds of genes. There's a male gene and a female gene, and that's how it is. So, in most countries, this whole gender ideology would be either laughed out of the discussion, or saying treated with contempt, which many countries just they say we'll have nothing of it. And yet the United States is saying, if you don't follow this fake ideology that we've just made up, we're going to attack your country. So this is all part of. So that is not Christian Zionism. That is just another form of acting out this kind of deep, aggressive attitude within the psychology of the American people. And even though we vote against these things, in the end, people just end up going along with it. And we haven't figured out a way to, rid ourselves of it. So that's what I want to say about that. Finally, Jimmy Carter, he died recently, and Carter had a very, what can I say, he had a spotty record. He came in as just a nice peanut farmer, and he was going to clean up the abuses of the CIA, and he brought Stansfield Turner in, who was supposed to clean things up, and maybe things improved a little bit, but the CIA is a they've got resources that you and I just can't imagine. But Jimmy Carter also hired this guy named Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was an arch Russophobe. He was from Polish nobility, and there's a strain within Poland that absolutely despises Russian culture, probably going back to the fact that Poland became Roman Catholic, and Russia maintained its Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox original roots. So there's this deep hostility between those two churches, and the Catholic Church historically has been very what's the word, adversarial to the Russian Orthodox Church. And kind of as an aside, it's interesting that Pope Francis, who recently died, was making kind of overtures towards the Russian Orthodox Church, and some people were welcoming that, but others didn't like him because he was more in favor of the kind of woke agenda. So he had a really mixed, mixed record, you could say. Some people say that he tried to help the Palestinians. He was on the phone with them every day, but could he have done more to end the genocide? Who can say? But getting back to Jimmy Carter, he initiated with the encouragement of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a socialist government at that time, and of course the United States hates socialism, and they hate the Soviet Union, and they hate Russia, so they basically empowered Al Qaeda, and this was Jimmy Carter, using Zbigniew Brzezinski. Eventually, the Russians, reluctantly went in there to help the government, and after about 10 years, they said, well, we've done about as much as we can do, and they withdrew with basically a staged, planned withdrawal. It wasn't chaotic the way it was with the United States. But what happened was that within about 3 years, again with CIA funding, these worst elements, these extremely reactionary elements that forced women to cover their whole bodies and wouldn't allow them to study these kinds of things. They were very very hostile towards any kind of liberalization of the society in favor of women. they lost, and Afghanistan has been in a state of chaos pretty much ever since. And that goes back to Jimmy Carter. But after he left office after 4 years, he became more involved in humanitarian efforts. So he had something called Habitat for Humanity, where he was trying to build housing for people. But here's the point: is that he recently made some remarks about the difference between how China has conducted its policy and the way the United States has conducted its policy. And he said, China in the last, 40, 50 years, all of its money has been poured into infrastructure, education, building up the country. It has not been involved in any wars except for 1979. There was a very brief war with Vietnam, but other than that, it's basically kept its nose clean and just built up the country. And the United States has expended its energy in the form of money in military adventurism all over the world. It basically militarized the country, and then but the results are clear. The Chinese economy has been consistently doing well, despite the fact that jealous American economists and commentators say, China's on its last legs, it's going to collapse. They've been saying that for years and years, and it doesn't seem to happen that way, because it appears that the Chinese government is actually committed towards making the country successful. It's not like China doesn't have some problems, but the problems are far, far different and far, far less than what the problems of the United States are. So, China, if you've ever been to China, which I have, I went there in 2007, and I met a monk there who was living outside of the city called Xiamen, and I would visit him, and they would basically bring a car to take me to his place in this suburb, you could say, of the city of Xiamen, and it was a dirt road, and but 2 years later, it was a paved road, and when I first took a train ride, it was a fairly decent train, but in later years, I was riding on these high-speed trains, which were they were like 3 times faster and more comfortable. So, China's been putting all this money into building itself up as a country, and the United States has been spending all this money on wars. That's what Jimmy Carter's message was. So, what I'm talking about here is that the degree of mismanagement of the United States has just been amazing. And the question is, what is the reason for that? Is it because the elites, the people who actually run the country, are, keep the people dumbed down? Or is it because the people themselves are in a state of, what can I call it, dystopic unconsciousness, where they simply cannot see what's being done to them in what they're allowing to have happen. So that's the situation. I'm not sure there's a way out of it. A lot of us are talking about this, and the purpose of my videos is to basically, raise these issues, and hopefully people will say, yeah, you're right. We need to be doing something about it. And the point is that what we need is a critical mass of people who are aware of these issues and are willing to bring it up with their friends and their colleagues and their family, and saying, we really need to do something about it. And no, Bernie Sanders is not the answer. We're going to have to find new leaders who can really do this, and we're going to have to build movements that will counter all these abuses that have been going on for so long, going back all the way to the American Revolution itself. So thank you for listening. Again, if you'd like to, you can buy one of my information T-shirts, and you can make a contribution through Substack also. So thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next time.